It's
Really good to see you all, everyone. So LiPS has been going so strong, and the PhD students and the UP office, we are collaborating this year. So Jake Berman, your speaker here, came to us the plant medicine. Some of you may be familiar with the plant medicine guidebook for planning program. That side, I feel like I'm not advertising for that site, but it really is. But that site also ranks best planning book each year. You should, I have to read that resource. Anyway, a lot of people, Jake's book, which you'll be talking about today, is among the 10 best planning books in 2024. And that's how I got to know Jake, really on paper. And luckily, he lives in New York. He has a background in history, also law school here in New York, and then working in his daytime job as a lawyer. But he is shall I say, avid fan of city transportation, in housing, zoning reform, lots of different topics. We have a lot of to know a little bit about Jake's interests. So I will leave the floor to Jake to talk about his book. And we were just walking to the VP lounge. Many of you were just finishing GIS, and I asked him, does he use that? He'll tell you. But so you all have some shared interests. He's a photographer, urbanist, in his daytime job, a lawyer. I shouldn't sell the specialty. I'll let you tell them if you want or not. Because it's actually very much relevant to many of the students' insights in the daytime job as well. In any case, enjoy his presentation and feel free to ask questions. I would say we go through about 30 to 40 minutes of presentation.
Yeah, sure. That's
Leave the rest for Q&A.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you, Jake.
Yeah, of course. Thank you to Professor Wu and to Columbia for having me. Thank you for the lovely introduction and for lunch. It's a pleasure to be here, even though I went to the law school downtown, and we have an NYU and Columbia have our rivalry where we have a basketball game. So that was the last time I was up here in a professional capacity. But anyway, so I'm here to talk about why transit is bad and why housing is expensive by international standards, with sidebars into all of the maps that I've created as part of the Lost Subways of North America project and later book. The key, of course, is that you guys as planning students know, like, other places don't do this, right? Like if you get on the train and in, say, Los Angeles, there's stuff near the train if you get off in downtown, but there's not stuff if you get off in on the west side of LA or in many of the suburban stations that they have. Now, this is not the way that they do it in Europe. It's not the way that they do it in Asia. And it's not the way that we used to do it in North America. So just to get a show of hands, is everybody here a planning student of some flavor or another? Okay, and some faculty, I presume. So I'm a lawyer by trade, and I got started on this because I got stuck in traffic one too many times when I lived in Los Angeles. About a decade and change ago, I'm stuck on the 101 freeway coming back from work, and I say to myself, my commute's only 5 miles. Why am I stuck behind this idiot in a Jeep with too many bumper stickers for the better part of an hour? What am I doing with my life, and what's wrong with Los Angeles? So what I did is that I got home eventually and said, I'm going to go to the library. I need to look and see just how LA turned out to be this mess of sprawl and smog and cars. What I found instead was a map designed by somebody long dead that said the Pacific Electric Railway in Southern California, the largest electric railway in the world. And my first thought was, what? In Los Angeles? Because I thought, well, it's LA. Of course, cars are the way that things work. of course, of course it is. It's a birthright, like tacos and tamales and the Dodgers. But that's not the case. LA used to be very, very different. And I was a history major undergrad, so I started going down the rabbit hole about this. As it turns out, things rhymed across most cities in North America, where you have the story of the rise and fall of public transport, the suburban boom, and the consequences that we now deal with today. So I made all these maps by a lot of archival research. Some of it came from public records requests, some of it came from digging in municipal archives, some of it came from the library up here, some of it came from the library at NYU downtown, and from archives all over the country. When putting the book project together, I picked the cities based on what would be interesting to tell these stories of what happened. So there's the obvious places where New York and San Francisco and LA have their own individual pathologies, and they're the big transit cities for the United States. Toronto and Montreal are obviously in because they're the big Canadian cities for transit. And then once it got to dealing with smaller cities, I wanted to illustrate specific points about how things rhyme. So if we want to talk about land use law near public transit and how it doesn't work, well, that's Dallas and Cleveland. Cities that generally don't have a whole lot in common with each other, except in that regard. Or if you want to talk about public process issues that keep housing and transit from getting built, well, that's San Francisco and New York. Or if you want to talk about, say, the race question in America, well, for that you have Detroit and Atlanta. Some things got omitted, and for length, like I would have loved to talk about the Portland, Oregon Ku Klux Klan taking over the city in the 1920s. That did not, it just didn't make the cut. So in this lecture, what I'm going to give is a three-part overview of how we got to this point with regard to transport and land use, because as you guys all know, they're all the same thing. Dallas has the same amount of track mileage as the Barcelona Metro, but the Barcelona Metro carries an order of magnitude more people than Dallas because of the land use in Barcelona, which is apartments everywhere, as opposed to the land use in Dallas, which is suburbs as far as the eye can see. There's going to be three divisions of this. The first is before 1945, then 1945 through 1980, and then 1980 to the present. Now, before 1945, the land use question is basically about organic regulation of growth. So the development follows the public infrastructure in a way that you can actually see if you get on the subway. My canonical example is if you get on the A train at Chambers Street downtown and just take the Lefferts Boulevard branch out to the end of the line at Lefferts Boulevard, you can see the way that the value of the land is mirrored in the amount of development, because that section of the line has existed since 1915 in one form or another, like the underground A train replaced an earlier elevator. So what happens here is that if you get on the train at Chambers Street, just get off, look around, towers everywhere. Go out further to Bed-Stuy at Nostrand Avenue or Utica Avenue, you have 5 or 6 story buildings and townhouses from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Then go further out to East New York, where you have 2- and 3-story townhouses built during the 1920s at like Euclid Avenue, right? And then once you get to the end of the line at Lefferts, it's recognizably suburban if you know what you're looking for. So if you look around at Lefferts Boulevard, sure, they're all 1918 or so built suburbs, but if you squint, you see that it's all single family homes. They have, they're detached from one another. They have front and backyards, and they have off-street parking, which is not that far from the Levitt towns that make up the endless miles of suburbia you see if you go out to Long Island a few miles east. Now, on the transport front, transport is getting built usually as a public-private partnership. So you have you have public financing, usually 50-50 between the company and the entity that's operating it, like the IRT or the Detroit United Railway, whatever, what have you. And on the private side, most critically, there's a sort of synergy between the transport side and the land use side in some manner or another. Sometimes it means that the transport company is a real estate developer. So in LA, the old Pacific Electric Railway was the largest real estate developer in Southern California. The Shaker Heights Rapid Transit, which is now the blue and green lines in Cleveland, was built by the Van Swearingen brothers, who were a bunch of very weird and very racist dudes that happened to know that building rapid transit to downtown Cleveland was how you got people to move out to their new subdivision in what's now Shaker Heights. And my best example of real estate development going with public transport is the Key system in the East Bay across the bridge from San Francisco, where the transit company was owned by an entity called the Realty Syndicate. Dudes built hotels. The other usual synergy that you find in this era is between electricity and public transport. So PSE&G, the Jersey Electric Company, used to run the trains. Same for Georgia Power in Atlanta, same for New Orleans Public Service in New Orleans, and Seattle Electric. Because at the time, it made perfect sense to electrify a neighborhood and then to make money running trains out to that neighborhood. Now, because of the network effects involved in this, these are natural monopolies that end up resulting. You know, the same way that it doesn't make sense to have two water companies or two gas companies, it doesn't make sense to have two transit companies. And during this era, things got done quickly because while urban planning as a profession did exist, it was largely focused on creating a pretty and usable built environment, as opposed to the kinds of process issues that you guys will have to deal with once you graduate. Like, most of the actual decisions were made by city councils with planners providing expertise, but there was no kind of back and forth where the developers go to the community board meeting, or the transit authority people go to the community board meeting and they have lots of people yell at them for 2 hours. That kind of thing just didn't happen. So the results of this, of course, are neighborhoods that everybody loves. Morningside Heights was one of those neighborhoods that got built out when Columbia moved from Washington Square to here. And oftentimes they're the most desirable neighborhoods in a particular metropolis. So Brookline, Massachusetts, Santa Monica and Los Angeles, as well as Beverly Hills. And you got high capacity functional transit, as well as neighborhoods that everybody likes. The flip side of this is that monopoly power is bad. You have wildly hilarious corruption scandals at the time, where the Market Street Railway in San Francisco bribed the Attorney General of California to quit his job as the statewide Attorney General to become the head of their legal department, and then had the ex-Attorney General go around distributing bribes on behalf of the Market Street Railway, which he beat the charges, but it very nearly landed him in prison. In Detroit, the sheer corruption of the old Detroit United Railway meant that the mayor, Jim Cousins, in the 1920s, was offered a deal to build a proper subway in Detroit. But it would require a joint venture with the hated Detroit United Railway. So Cousins said, no, absolutely not. We have to take it over and make it a publicly owned utility first before we try to make any major rapid transit expansion, because the company is just this bad. If you want to think about it in modern political terms, it's a little bit like people saying, you know, that Zuckerberg guy, that Musk guy, we should give them a ton of money. Like that's just not something that's popular these days, the same way that giving the transit barons money was not popular either. At the time, there were only really 3 choices that cities could make when it came to deal with the transit barons. Option 1 is you grin and bear it. That's what they did in LA. That's what they did in Portland. That's what they did in Boston. Option number two is you create a publicly owned transit company to compete with the privately owned transit monopoly, like what happened in New York City with the independent subway system and the San Francisco Municipal Railway in SF. Then option three is to just buy it out entirely, which is what Seattle and Detroit did. The city ended up taking over the trains and running them themselves. At the same time, you also have competition from municipalities where, like, sometimes they take like a comme ci, comme ça kind of way of doing things, where the city would create a competing transit company for part of it. So like in Los Angeles, the city of Santa Monica created something that's now called the Big Blue Bus in order to compete with the old Pacific Electric Railway, even if it wasn't competing on every single route that the old Pacific Electric had. And during this era, it starts to come to a close because of the automobile and the bus. And by 1940, there's a sea change underway as the Davison Freeway in Detroit and the Pasadena Freeway in Los Angeles open, which is where we go on to the freeway era. Any questions so far? No? All right, cool. So then we go into the second phase of what happened, which is from 1945 to 1980. Land use during this period is much more heavily regulated, but it's still pretty loosey-goosey. So this is how you get the copy-pasted Levitt towns on Long Island. It's how you get towers in rich neighborhoods, like, you know, all those like boxy white brick apartment buildings that you see like on the Upper East and Upper West sides? Those. And you also see small scale mass development in places like Los Angeles and the San Francisco Bay Area. There is a wonderful book called The Low-Rise Speculative Apartment, which came out around 1964, published by the University of California, that talks about the ways that these small scale apartment buildings got built, where you'll have like an 8 or 12 unit wood frame building built by somebody who isn't even a professional developer, because that's how easy it was to build something back then. You just showed up with money and the plans and they would rubber stamp it, as long as it met the zoning standards and the building code, which is just not something that happens today. And coupled with that is the fact that like real estate development during the time got very favorable tax treatment. So a lot of these apartment buildings that were built during the period, which are, you know, they're boxy, they're wood, they're nothing special, but they're what we'd call today as workforce housing. They're totally fine, but they were shelters for taxes for wealthy lawyers and doctors who wanted to avoid their taxes. I mean, everybody wins, right? During this period, you also have the breakage of the synergy between transport and real estate development because of the antitrust enforcement of the period. So transport companies were offered a choice. Either they could confine their activities to one particular area or one particular state, or they would have to sell off their non-transport related businesses. So for instance, Georgia Power, which was the transit company and electric company in Atlanta, became only the electric company. And same thing with PSE&G, which hasn't run trains since the 1950s, I think. At the time, you had this kind of utopian zeitgeist where we come to the era of Bob Moses demolishing chunks of the Bronx to build the Cross Bronx Expressway. But keep in mind that this is part of a long tradition of urban development. So if you go to Paris, the grand boulevards of Paris, built by Baron Haussmann, were built on the exact same model. That is, let's demolish all of these crummy, slummy neighborhoods and run a big, beautiful road through it. Like the Cross Bronx Expressway is the same width as Boulevard Richard Lenoir in the 11th arrondissement in Paris. They're both 200 feet wide, but One of them is ugly, gross, and full of traffic, and the other one is full of kids playing soccer in the parkland that occupies the median. And you can see a little bit of where all of this came from because so many major roadways in America are called parkways. They were originally meant to be, in some form or other, recreational. During this period, there's also huge mass transit investments. This is the era where the San Francisco Bay Area builds BART. You get the Red Line in Cleveland, the DC Metro, and MARTA in Atlanta. And all of these things were built, and as part of this like utopian future that they were building, all of them were built kind of weird. And in a lot of ways, they threw the baby out with the bathwater and forgot the lessons of the past when they were doing it. So to give a classic example, almost every train in the world runs on a gauge where the rails are 4 feet, 8.5 inches apart. With BART, they built it 5'6". Why? Who knows? And like even the official BART history makes mention of having the tracks slightly wider apart in order to get it across the Golden Gate Bridge, but that line was canceled at the very beginning of the planning process. So they really had no idea what they were doing. And the same thing goes for the planning approach to transit, right? Where these mass transit systems built at enormous expense during this period were built so that people would park and ride. So the Metro Rail in Miami, MARTA, BART, you were supposed to drive your car to your suburban station, get on the train, and that'll take you downtown. That also didn't work because we forgot the lessons of the past in this period. This also sees the final disappearance of most surface level streetcars, unless you have really, really weird local politics like Toronto or New Orleans, or you have constrained conditions where it's too narrow to fit a bus. So classic examples are San Francisco, where they have the Twin Peaks and Sunset tunnels, and same thing in Philadelphia with the Market Street Tunnel, where it's just too narrow to turn those tunnels into a busway, so they kept trains. Now, before we get into like the common myth that that there was some kind of conspiracy to get rid of the streetcars, that's just not the case unless you're in Minneapolis. The streetcar removal was the product of boring old economics, where the transit companies would run streetcars or buses. They were pretty agnostic as to which one they would run based on the conditions existing in that particular line. And at the time of the Great Streetcar Shutdown after World War II, the transit companies had a choice. They could make massive upgrades to their lines, replace worn out rolling stock, rails, and essentially reconstruct them from scratch, or they could just say, whatever, and replace them with buses. Like Los Angeles was offered a chance to take what remained of the old Pacific Electric Railway in 1948 and turn it into what we would recognize today as a form of light rail. But that never happened because Angelenos didn't want to spend the money and the city council voted it down. Now, in a lot of these cases, the transit companies are the ones driving this as opposed to some evil GM conspiracy, where Pacific Electric in 1946 said that unless they were going to get state subsidies to keep running trains, they would just shut the whole thing down and replace it with buses. Adding to this is the fact that the old worn out rolling stock of the era was, well, kind of crummy, quite frankly. And when offered the choice between a bus that had heating and air conditioning versus a streetcar built 30 years ago that was on its last legs, kind of rattle-trappy, and didn't have AC in the summer, it was a no-brainer even for passengers. Now, the results of this we all know about, right? That the cities were devastated. There was the urban crisis of the late 20th century. There was white flight as the neighborhoods that were demolished turned into either slums or public housing where poor people, minorities, and poor minorities were concentrated. And in response to this overreach, you see the celebrated freeway revolts of the mid-20th century. So San Francisco cancels the Panhandle Freeway through Golden Gate Park. New York City cancels the Lower Manhattan Expressway and most of the remaining expressways through central Brooklyn and the city proper. And Boston cancels everything new inside of Route 128 after a moratorium placed by Governor Francis Sargent. Now, as part of this reaction, you see the great environmental laws come into view. You know, the California Environmental Quality Act out in California, Seeker out here, the state equivalent in New York, and NEPA, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and so forth and so on. Now, all of these laws put an effort on deciding like what's the correct process to follow when putting together new public infrastructure and new housing. So the idea with all of these is that if you get all of the procedures right, you check all the boxes, then great, you're free and clear to do whatever you want, as opposed to focusing on the actual outcomes, right? Which meant that later on, all of these environmental laws end up getting weaponized by people who want to block, say, new public transport or new housing. At the same time, because segregation was finally made illegal, restrictive zoning goes into overdrive on the housing front. So just to, yeah, you couldn't block minorities legally from moving to your leafy suburb, but you could certainly do a lot of that by saying that your leafy suburb is now single family only, and so minorities are priced out. So just to give a sense of the scale of the thing, with the Detroit suburbs in 1970, Dearborn, population 104,199, Blacks, 13. Livonia, population 110,199, Blacks, 41. Troy, population 39,419, Blacks, 1. And just like housing, transit becomes a proxy for race, both in the North and the South. So when BART gets first approved in 1962 in San Francisco, San Mateo County to the south opts out because they were afraid of Asians and Blacks coming out of the city and moving to San Mateo County, which is ironic given that San Mateo County is now extremely heavily Asian. But heaven forbid that we have the Chinese in San Mateo. MARTA in Atlanta gets the sobriquet, and pardon me, it's ridiculously racist, moving Africans rapidly through Atlanta. And in Detroit, every suburban newspaper, of which there were about 30, collectively published the same section saying that, no, you shouldn't build Mayor Coleman Young subway. And Mayor Coleman Young was the firebrand first Black mayor of Detroit. Public housing turned out to be a mess. And the results that you can see from post-war urban development are really not great. I mean, I can't think of any that really is a pleasant place to be by modern urbanist standards. And worse, a lot of the copy-paste suburbs of the era are not financially sustainable, unlike the streetcar suburbs of an era before, because they're not dense enough. So like Nassau County out on Long Island, Warren, Michigan, outside Detroit, and San Bernardino outside Los Angeles are all facing the same type of infrastructure crisis because there isn't the tax base there to support all of the water mains, the roadways, the sanitation pickup, the levels of basic services that were originally subsidized by federal money and the real estate developers that built these areas. It's an absolute time bomb. And that, coupled with the fact that you now have these restrictive zoning laws, made it really hard for these places to get more tax revenue by growing vertically. That said, I think it's useful to have some perspective on what they were trying to fix back then. Pollution is a lot less bad and obvious than it used to be. Like the Cuyahoga River doesn't catch fire anymore. You can kayak in it. Los Angeles smog isn't like a brown cloud that you can see 24/7. no, like you actually have nice days a lot of the time in Los Angeles when there isn't a wildfire. And in like a kind of cockamamie way, the kind of slum clearance that ended the tenement era kind of sort of did solve the slums problem. I have a personal anecdote for this where my mother-in-law grew up in a bunch of like X-shaped co-ops downtown on Grand Street, the Seward Park co-ops. And she was a little kid and she had just moved from an overcrowded tenement building to one of these brand new co-ops that were financed by the garment workers unions. And she and her brother both had a massive freak out. Her brother was freaking out because her brother was at age 5, got lost in their 2-bedroom, 1,000-square-foot apartment. And she was freaking out because the toilet was in their apartment and she thought that all the neighbors on the floor were going to walk down the hall and use the toilet. Like, it's really hard now in the 21st century to think of what things were like in the mid-20th in downtown Manhattan. Which brings us to the present era, which I'm sure you're learning about in your classes, where the unintended consequences of restrictive land use are that neighborhoods are largely frozen in time. The only places that you can build are the types of post-industrial, somewhat polluted pieces of land, like, say, the Williamsburg waterfront, or places that are historically minority, like, say, Bed-Stuy, which is how you get the gentrification and displacement discourse that people talk about a lot on Twitter. And you also get further sprawl because it's so hard to build stuff in the city. So in the 2010s, LA built 5.5 new homes. Sorry, LA added 5.5 new jobs for every new home they built. San Francisco added 7. And to keep prices more or less stable, you need to keep that ratio at like 1.5 new jobs for every new home you build. And because there's this underlying assumption that development is bad, this is how you also end up with a homeless crisis. And it's how you end up with a lot of these angry community board meetings where the consultation is theoretically, community consultation isn't happening within the political system where, you know, you elect a city councilman and the city councilman votes like you want, but rather it's a bunch of people yelling at the unelected community board who convey their displeasure to the city councilman. And it's a great way to set up a local veto, but it's a really hard way to get things actually done unless there's a lot of shameless corruption. Now, you also end up with this realization on the land use front that, yeah, we kind of did screw up. And because we screwed up, well, we need to try to recreate those walkable, interesting neighborhoods of the past. But by and large, you end up with a lot of like simulacrums of the real thing. Like everyone knows the type, right? Like it's the quote unquote urban shopping mall where it's like 2 or 3 strolling streets that have a correct urban design with apartments above, but surrounding the area is all garages. So like I'm originally from the San Francisco Bay Area, and you know that's what Santana Row in San Jose is. And same thing for Crocker Park outside Cleveland and the King of Prussia Mall outside Philly. Now, like transport, like the public transport scene, as a lot of you guys know, is that transport gets treated like an amenity. So that's how you end up with light rail lines getting built way out to the burbs. So DART in Dallas, VTA light rail in San Jose, the Tren Urbano in Puerto Rico. They go out to the burbs as a nice urban amenity to get downtown for a game, but they're not actually that useful in terms of day-to-day public transportation. And a lot of these places are built without properly supported land uses, which the end result being that you get a lot of really expensive underused infrastructure with maybe a train every 20 minutes if you're lucky. And a lot of issues relating to that, where the freeways are overcrowded, the trains don't run often enough, but the trains also don't go somewhere useful. And if you want to build something way out in the burbs, on the other hand, there's no one to complain about it. because we don't build a whole lot of transit in the 21st century, this is how you end up with it being expensive and bad. Like, there's no universal standards anymore for how or about what the correct type of light rail car is. Whereas in the 1930s, the country standardized on one design and built tons of them. It's called the President's Conference Car, or PCC. You can still see them running in San Francisco. And the trains are nearly a century old. And what transport does get built is usually way too expensive for its own good, and it's heavily custom designed. So classic examples, the Second Avenue subway, the BART extension to San Jose, or like countless busways, which end up getting gold plated with things that aren't really necessary instead of doing the kind of copy paste that you need. And you have like a sort of death by public process to a lot of projects, because every little iota of every little thing needs to be discussed ad nauseum for years. So the Geary Busway in San Francisco, where I'm from, is something that runs from downtown to the beach, 7 miles more or less. And it was originally slated to be a light rail line with tunnels under downtown San Francisco. The line isn't even a full-length busway yet. And San Franciscans have been paying taxes since 1989 for that, when I was 3. Yes, I know I'm dating myself. Same thing here with the Second Avenue subway. The MTA approved the line in the year 2000, when, I'll take a guess, many of you didn't know how to read yet. So like coupled with that is like the hollowing out of in-house expertise, which means that there's too much reliance on consulting firms, and consulting firms don't have the kind of store of local institutional knowledge that you need to run to run and build new transit. So that brings us to the question of, well, what comes next? What do we have to do to fix this? I have a few recommendations. Feel free to tell me if I'm wrong in the Q&A. And the first one is just to fix your bureaucracy. There is a lovely saying in German, Organisation vor Elektronik vor Beton, or organization, then electronics, then concrete. Because it's cheap and easy to fix your bureaucracy, even if it's politically difficult. And changes in organization can be made quickly and cheaply, because it doesn't require new laws, it doesn't require a ton of money, it doesn't require a ton of digging, versus electronics installation and pouring concrete. One of the things you can do with fixing the bureaucracy is to import foreign standards and experts who really know what they're doing. The Spanish are past masters at building subway lines, and Madrid can build a fully underground subway line for the cost of what the United States pays for at-grade light rail. The Japanese build 2.5 times more housing than we do in New York City. We should import their expertise on how do they do their construction? How do they do their zoning? What's their planning process look like? How do they actually make it so that Tokyo is far cheaper than New York? And it's going to sound kind of ridiculous, but this is not a place where the United States should be innovating. We should be imitating. Like, take the best of what ideas they have in foreign countries, especially outside the Anglosphere, and shamelessly rip off their ideas. There's a great example of this in the way that Istanbul built local expertise in how to build subways. There's a great report by the Marin Institute out of NYU. It's Levy, Ansari, and Goldwyn about how Istanbul went from 0 subways to a full-blown metropolitan subway system in 40 years. And now most of it is native built because the Turks imported expertise, brought in these smart people to teach them how to do it. And then the first generation of trained Turks trained the next generation of trained Turks. And as a part of this, it means that you have to have proper standards for the way to do things. So model station designs, model building designs, pre-approval of buildings. And if you want to see what this looked like back in the day when the United States actually did this, get on the one train. Like the one train is full copy paste all the way down to Times Square. Same thing for the 6 from 42nd to Brooklyn Bridge. And these standardizations were measures of economy taken by the old IRT, which ran it, but it doesn't mean that they were wrong. Same thing for housing, where the Sears catalog used to sell houses that you could build yourself. Like you could, like the same way that like, you know, you can go on Amazon and order a bicycle or something. You used to be able to go to the Sears catalog and order a house. And it was guaranteed to meet whatever standards were necessary to build a perfectly safe, nice house or small apartment building in 1905. Now, as far as the legal changes, you also have to streamline your public processes. It means that like, instead of having this back and forth over whether it's too much or too little, or it needs to be more rent controlled or less rent controlled, to build an apartment building in Manhattan is all a bad faith waste of time. Make the decisions up front with your zoning laws and let developers cook. I know this is, you know, you can yell at me during the Q&A. And but the upside of this is that once you start making these reforms, things can actually get done quickly. Like this stuff wasn't handed down on Mount Sinai. Like if you go to Tokyo or Paris or London, things are not as bad as they are in the United States. And things are already starting to change. Like California's state legislature decided to finally nuke zoning from orbit and say, everything within a half-mile radius of a busway or a train station has to be zoned for apartments. You have parking reform where they just abolish the minimum parking rules because it's stupid to require 400 square foot of parking for a 400 square foot apartment. And then there's the question of permitting reform where, you know, you start to see the beginnings of this with City of Yes here in New York. But that's the key, right? Is that we have to think about what do we need to do in order to make things better? And as planners, that's going to be your job for the next few decades going forward. Thanks a lot. I'm happy to take questions. Yes.
Do you not think GM has something to do with LA's?
No. I mean, so national city lines, just get into like very, very nitty gritty details of how LA's transit system was shut down. General Motors and the consortium that owned like national city lines, yes, they did shut down LA's trolley network, but the final shutdown was actually done once it was owned by LA County. LA County could have kept it open, and public entities across the country shut down streetcars just as surely as their privately owned competitors did. So the Detroit Department of Transportation, which was formerly Detroit Street Railways, came under public control in 1922, plus or minus a year or two, and they shut down all their trains in 1958. Seattle shut down all their trains around 1940, 1941. And the key is that's just what people did at the time. There was no, like, in the two situations where they kept surface streetcars that didn't have like elevated trench or tunnel sections that were too narrow for buses, those are Toronto and New Orleans. New Orleans has some really, really weird local politics because the millionaires who lived along St. Charles Avenue, where the surviving streetcar line runs, thought it was much more charming to have like grass with tracks in the median and a bunch of flowers planted and stuff like that, as opposed to more asphalt. And it was purely an aesthetic consideration that led New Orleans to keep that one streetcar line, even though they shut down all the rest. And in Toronto, what happened was the city government got really clever and said, man, all of these companies, all of these cities, they're selling off their trains. We can get all this stuff on the cheap and it's barely used. Like, you know, they were thinking, oh, well, we need new trains. We can just pick them up from everywhere else. And it was purely a question of economics. Because the deal is, like, a streetcar that runs in mixed traffic, that runs short trains, like, you know, single car trains in mixed traffic, they're worse than a bus at getting people from A to B, because if some jerk parks on the tracks, you're stuck. Like, unless you have like a towing company ready just to drag everybody off the tracks. And it's one reason that the DC streetcar, which was built at great expense 10, 15 years ago, ended up failing and getting shut down because it was running in mixed traffic and people were parking on the tracks. So like, like you really need to make the kinds of major investments that they did in, say, San Francisco or Pittsburgh or Philly in order to make urban at-grade rail work well. And if you're not going to make those investments, I think it's kind of a waste of money.
So there was definitely some influence with like the trends that were going on with cars. But like people adopting cars and that kind of drove the convenience.
Right. I mean, like there were people saying like, no, that's, you know, like, let's not do this. But in general, the thought of the time was, you know, trains are the past, cars are the future, so we need to follow up with the future. My one case where there was a conspiracy is Minneapolis, where the mob was involved, and that involves a crooked lawyer, a finance bro, and the kingpin of the Minneapolis mob. So what happened there? I know this is not the question you asked, but so the kingpin of the Minneapolis mob was a major shareholder in the Twin City Rapid Transit Company. And this finance bro named Charles Green comes to Minneapolis and says, man, we can make some real money, like private equity style, right? Like we could make some real money if we stripped down the company and changed everything over from streetcar to bus. And we fired all these nice Minnesotans who are running things in a competent fashion. So he sits down with this crooked lawyer, Fred Ozana, and the kingpin of the Minneapolis mob, a guy named Isidore Blumenfield. And they all sit down in the back room at the Club Carnival, which is a nightclub that no longer exists. I swear, it is like a mob movie. And they decide that, yes, they're going to take over the company, which they do, and sell it off for parts. Now, the finance bro gets sidelined very early on, but the gangster and the crooked lawyer take bribes and sell all of the trains and equipment and rolling stock at cut rate prices. Then the feds come calling, they arrest everybody. The kingpin beats the charges, the crooked lawyer goes to jail, but Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, the father of the HHS secretary, decides this is nonsense. We're going to take this guy down. So they take down the mob kingpin of Minneapolis because he transported a prostitute from Chicago to Minneapolis. That's a federal crime. Yes.
This is fascinating. First, a really quick comment and then a question. This helped me actually understand when I first went to Tufts.
Mm-hmm.
I never understood why they wanted to spend 8 years extending the main line that was 19th century technology.
Mm-hmm.
I think you provided some answer to that question.
Yes.
It did not make economic sense or structural.
Yeah.
But they did it finally with operating a chaka 19th century.
Yeah.
Really amazing.
Yeah.
Really, my view is more on the side of your recommendation, fixing regulations and institutions. I do feel that the US faces two unique challenges that many others, especially the big cities, don't quite. So I wanted to see your perspective. One is urban remains central in most of the other than this country is different, right? Urban is not, I mean, maybe New York or one cities, but urban is 1%.
Right.
And more importantly, is the fragmentation of finance. So I was in Hamburg, then they're doing this basically 10 times bigger than they did, and they call it big link is that they try to seek some highways that
Mhm.
60s to also facilitate more urban sort of environment as well as to use. Right,
Mhm.
so they have the national government, Flemish regional government,
Mhm.
and then, of course, the city all invest together
Mhm.
in this very large project that's taken 10 years now, still not finished. And I just don't see that happen. You know, if you look at Martha,
Mhm.
Minneapolis, they all kind of regional government
Mhm.
at some
Mhm.
but if you look at New York,
Mhm.
pretty fiction.
Also, the Port Authority is trash.
But just like it's
Yeah, I know, no, yeah, no, of course.
that fragmentation, not so much politics, but it's really about finance. That makes it very different.
I don't think it's a question of public finance so much as a question of public permitting. In the United States, up until about 1980, the way that large-scale mass transit was built was by a simple federal grant with an 80-20 match. So, like MARTA was built with, like the Congress said, here's X dollars to build a subway system, and then they built MARTA. The money was originally offered to Detroit, but Detroit couldn't get its race question tamped down enough to actually build a subway, so they didn't get one. But I don't think it's necessarily a matter of money or finance so much as just the layers of government that have to approve the thing. In most European countries, like subway construction, once it's approved, is self-permitting. And like the Madrid Transport Consortium doesn't have to go back to the city of Madrid or the city of Getafe or the city of whatever. No, they just do it because they have their own independent authority to do it that crosses jurisdictional lines. Like I don't think it's necessarily the question of the money not being.
Yeah, I think, yeah, because I think Transport London also pipe time.
Yeah, exactly.
Go directly. That's
Right.
Question on the first question, for yourself, for the most part, partial driver transportation are word state, but they now provide an opportunity to develop housing to POD near interurban space, not the parking lot. As a lawyer and historian, what regulatory codes you believe would be most successful in encouraging such development, and more importantly, to ensure the outcomes of such development and equitable and more.
Okay, so do you guys hear the question? Okay, so I think that they should just, like, to make it possible, you still have to have the, there are a bunch of different ways to skin a cat. If you want to do it the libertarian way, you could just say, let the zoning, like, sell off the land and let the developers build whatever they want, like they do in Houston. If you want to do it the neoliberal way, like they do it in Tokyo, the transit companies are, like, you have loose zoning and you just allow development within a regulatory framework that rubber stamps things if they meet the zoning laws, coupled with transit companies acting as developers themselves. Like the MTR in Hong Kong and Japan Rail are both famous for being real estate developers, such that Japan Rail East, which I think is the largest Japan Rail unit, takes in roughly 15-20% of their revenues from real estate development. So hotels, shopping malls, apartment buildings, stuff that goes on land near the stations. And one thing that actually shocks me, I know this is a sidebar, but one thing that shocks me about Japan is that Japan doesn't really have like beautiful railway stations like European cities do. They're all kind of like pen, like they're warrens of concrete because they're all being constantly developed by the railway company. And of course, you could just do the social housing route, which is what Singapore does. But in terms of getting things that are fair or equitable or the, I think that there has to be a definition of what fair and equitable is. A lot of the politics around housing development are the question of, should this all be rent stabilized, government funded affordable housing? Are we okay morally with providing more units in the aggregate if 80% of the units or 90% of the units are market rate? I take the YIMBY approach and say that more units are always better. And if you can get, just to give a worked example, if you can get, say, 20 units that's 100% affordable versus 100 units that are market rate and 25 units that are stabilized and affordable, well, that's a win for everyone. And the thing about the equity claim is that, especially on the coasts, it ends up being kind of a canard for a lot of bad faith NIMBYism, where, like, an example from my book was the old Coronet Theater outside San Francisco, where there was a government-funded, 100% affordable senior housing development off Geary Boulevard, which is a very busy transit corridor. And the neighbors were able to nitpick it for 10 years, first on the, like, oh, is this truly equitable? Do we really want this? Well, okay, but we're going to nitpick this about parking. We're going to nitpick this about, views, or replacing a 4-story theater with a 6-story apartment building. And quite frankly, I think that the most units is the best way of doing things, because rich people will live wherever they want. Like in San Francisco, where I'm from, when I graduated law school, this was now 15 years ago, in San Francisco, because they don't let you build anything, all of the people who are going into fancy law firms were moving to, like, and making at the time $160,000 a year, were moving into my old neighborhood, which is traditionally working class, Black and Russian, and moving into 100-year-old units because there were no new fancy units to move into. Whereas in New York City, where they were building a lot more, all of those fancy corporate law types decided to move to brand new buildings on the far west side, or in Williamsburg, or in Hell's Kitchen. And there wasn't nearly as many people deciding that it would be a great idea to move to Bed-Stuy.
Thanks for a great talk, Jane. You think there are in the US that are doing a good job at building it or not? You think that relatively cheaply?
Montreal. So Montreal is kind of weird because they speak French, and they're no. This is a real no. I'm not. It's not like I'm not cracking a joke at the expense of French. I'm saying that because they live in the Francophone world, they have access to a lot more best practices from the French-speaking world, like Belgium and France, that they can draw on when it comes to building transit cheaply. So the Caisse de dépôt de Québec, which is the provincial pension fund, actually has an infrastructure building wing that built a whole new light metro line at less than the cost of Interborough Express. And the thing at, cost per mile, way like half the price of Interborough Express. And it was done by a public authority that knew how to do these things. Like, the people in Montreal know their stuff. Yes.
So, from Montreal. I agree with what you're saying about but I don't know how much you know about it. They don't have like zoning control around the stations, so they build trains, like automated light rails out to suburbs of Canada, and they doubled the capacity of the existing network. But I don't know, with zoning control, that's something that the City of Montreal should have given. It's like public-private partnership to maximize the usage of the system, or because private, they don't want to see too much.
I'm not as worried about the City of Montreal as I am worried about the suburbs. Like, if you're like, the City of Montreal is already extremely dense and has high transit ridership. But once you start talking about the burbs, that's a much harder question. Like, extending it, like the various extensions, like across the St. Lawrence, or I think they have one branch that's going off the Isle of Montreal in the other direction. Like, that's where the easy money is. And it's one of the things where I wish that they had something like California's Bill SB 79, which requires rezoning as a matter of law near the stations. I don't know whether that would have been possible given provincial politics, but you're shaking your head. Got it. Yeah, I mean, like it is a good example of how to do things well on the cheap. It's the kind of thing that the MTA should seriously consider with Interborough Express, or if you really want to get fancy, think about doing it with the Port Washington branch of the Long Island Railroad. Because the Port Washington branch runs out to Great Neck through a bunch of heavily underserved neighborhoods parallel to the overcrowded 7 train. And there's not a whole lot of freight service on that corridor anyway. So like, anyway, that's my sidebar to talk about the Port Washington line. But yeah, like I don't really care that much whether you build a lot in terms of whether it's public, whether it's private, whether it's with top-down zoning or with local zoning doing the right thing. The results are what matter, not the process. Yes?
Thank you. In the context of current administration, both deregulating a lot of industry, also divesting from public transit, while public transit is at ridership all-time lows. How do you see decreasing bureaucracy, increasing investment occurring within that context?
So there's 2 parts to this. First is that the United States capital construction costs are obscene. And the idea of, well, yeah, we can keep affording to build subway lines at 1.8 billion a mile is just like, that's crazy. Like it's not going to happen. Even if it was happening under the last administration or the first Trump administration, like something needs to change. And this is an opportunity to do so. As far as transit operations, this is also a time to take a serious look at the kinds of local policies to reduce your transit costs, not just like taking a meat axe to it. So a great example of this is the Long Island Railroad's labor policies, which is not a sentence that I ever thought that I would ever say. But like the Long Island Railroad requires usually 4 crew members per train, which means that it's incredibly expensive per mile to run these trains because you have 3 guys just sitting around and checking tickets like it's 1890 instead of having proof of payment or having turnstiles like every other transit network outside the United States. I mean, you could even look to ones within the United States that have proof of payment, like the entire San Francisco municipal railway system, but you have to look at ways to economize on your operations, and this, quite frankly, is an opportunity to do it. I mean, yes, you could be like SEPTA in Philly and just say, well, whatever, we're just gonna take an axe to it and burn the capital construction costs. Sorry, the capital construction fund. But I think a better approach to this is to do what they did in Illinois, where all of the fragmented transit agencies were finally unified under one umbrella and given a permanent source of revenue, and more importantly, a planning fund to start thinking about what is the best way to get you from A to B at a metropolitan level. What is it? Service-led planning is the buzzword that they use. What's the best way to get people from A to B at a metropolitan level, whether it's a bus, a train, regional rail? They don't have light rail in Chicago, but like, what is the best way of getting people around mode agnostic, as opposed to the individual departments where Metra, the commuter rail agency, thought, well, yeah, of course they're going to take the commuter trains. CTA, which ran the subways, which has city subways and buses, well, of course it's going to be the CTA subways and buses. And unifying those things at a metropolitan level and really thinking big about what types of problems do we face and how do we correct them, like this is the opportunity for that. Oh, in the back.
It's a question about like lost trail, the tracks kind of.
Sorry, I can't hear you. Could you?
When you're talking about like abandoned tracks, it kind of Highline project.
Mhm.
And I kind of wondered what your thoughts about it. It's a heavily like private and project that kind of transformed, essentially gentrified, but had the kind of intention of revitalizing acts, and
Mhm.
you think that this approach can be implemented maybe at a larger scale or at a different context.
Mhm.
Yeah, I just kind of want thoughts about.
Rail trails are a great idea if you don't need the tracks for anything. The High Line in particular is an obsolete freight railway. Was an obsolete freight railway that didn't connect to anything except for Penn Station. And there was no way to really convert it to be used for proper public transit use, given the curves, the narrowness, and like the extremely constrained environment. So it doesn't bother me that they converted the High Line into a park. What does bother me is when they convert useful right of way into something that's like parkland. So a great example of this is the Rockaway Beach branch in Queens, where there's an old Long Island Railway, the Long Island Railroad line that used to go from the 63rd Street station on the Queens Boulevard line to the Rockaways. Now, the subway at 63rd Street already has a short connecting tunnel leading to that elevated abandoned right-of-way. This is a really obvious way to add new transit service to Eastern Queens on the cheap, but a lot of the plans for using this right-of-way are just to convert it into High Line East. I think that's a mistake. Because first and foremost, it's almost impossible to recreate right-of-way once it's lost to something else. Like if you have, like there's a great example of something called the Culver Line, which used to exist in Brooklyn, in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, where it was a shuttle train running like 4 avenues from one end to the other. And the MTA demolished the elevated in the 1970s and just said, whatever, we'll sell it off to developers. And now that line will be impossible to rebuild. And then?
Private development. In Montreal, what are your thoughts on like the Brightline East, Brightline West? California.
Brightline East and Brightline West are fine. I mean, I'm pretty agnostic as to whether it's private companies or public entities doing it or PPPs. It's all the same to me. It's the results that count. There are issues with Brightline East where they have an unusually high fatality rate along the tracks. But I blame the Florida Department of Transportation for that, because their work on protecting grade crossings has been trash. Like they just haven't done enough to protect the railway, which was there before the streets, from cross traffic. And it's the kind of thing where, I mean, it's a shame that Brightline East has high fatality rates, but it's also that like, I don't understand how Florida ends up doing something so poorly that like extremely frequent fast trains run along at grade lines in California all the time, right? Like the Amtrak Capital Corridor, the Pacific Surfliner, they are not fully grade separated, and none of them have these kinds of problems that they do in Florida. So at the risk of making a Florida man joke, Florida man. And Florida man drives on tracks anyway. But as far as Brightline East goes, I think it's a good idea, and I hope they make it work. Brightline West, which is the high-speed railway from Vegas to Los Angeles. I hope they get it to work, because it really does satisfy the sweet spot for high-speed rail, because driving there is a pain in the neck, but it's a very short flight, and getting to LAX is awful. Like, if you want to know whether somebody is your BFF in Los Angeles, you ask them for a lift to LAX. Mhm.
But do you think the impact of bills like S79 might weaponize blocking transit to make the dynamics you talked about in the past?
Yes, I fully expect SB 79 to be used as a weapon against new transit getting built. And that's part of the chicken and egg problem of building transit, is that you shouldn't be building high capacity transport, public transport in suburbs that aren't going to ride it. As much as I hate saying that we shouldn't build new transit, like if they're not going to do anything near the train lines or the bus lines, well, yeah, what do you think is going to happen? I think one more question. No? Okay, great. Thanks so much for having me.